My name is Leroy Halsey, that's my middle name, and I'm a structural engineering professor here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I started in school at a little place called Rolla, Missouri, then graduated, got a master's degree from that same school, headed off to work in the consulting engineering environment. During that time I started working on a PhD at the University of Illinois Champaign. The reason I went there is because that was probably the #1 school in the nation in structural engineering, and I wanted to study under the best. So I just want to come to you today and kind of share with you some exciting news here at UAF. We do have over $121 million building, and as part of that, we've got a high bay test facility. We can basically do airplane wings, 2-story buildings easily, shear walls, which is what we've got laying down there right now to do some testing on. We're going to be actually doing testing with undergraduate students instead of graduate students, which is pretty exciting if you stop and think about it, because they get a chance to do testing as part of their coursework, which you don't always get. So that's pretty exciting. My favorite part of being a professor is to help a person become better than they are. Watching the light bulb come on and seeing the person realize, oh my gosh, I really understand this. Did you get your report in on your testing?
After all the dwindling it down, there's still 4,500 data points. Wow.
Good. Sounds exciting. You guys have a nice break. Nice holiday.
You filming something?
Huh?
You filming a project?
Yeah, this is the World Trade Center thing.
Oh.
Yeah, so.
Well, it's been a point of controversy now for more than a decade. A researcher now from the University of Alaska Fairbanks is weighing in.
Dr. Leroy Halsey, a civil engineering professor at UAF, he led a 4-year study which reevaluates whether Building 7's collapse could have been caused by fire.
It is beautiful outside, perfect September day with lots of sunshine.
Other than that, it's kind of quiet around the country. We like quiet. It's quiet. It's too quiet.
Show you a picture of the World Trade Center, where I understand, do we have it?
Apparently, a plane has just crashed into the World Trade Center here in New York City. It happened
Un avión chocó contra el World Trade Center de Nueva York, que sería una de las dos.
I was living in Oakland, California, and I was involved in a little incident of crime in my own neighborhood at that morning. I had been awoken early, before dawn, by some activity in the street outside, and I looked outside and there were 3 individuals out there that were stripping the tires off of a vehicle. Shortly after that, a tow truck came to tow the car away, and the tow truck driver was an old friend of mine that I hadn't seen in years. So we were standing out in front talking, and he got a call on the radio, and he went over and he came back and he said to me, somebody just flew a plane into one of the World Trade Center towers in New York City.
Witnesses say it may have been a twin-engine plane or possibly could have been a 737 again.
Those days we used to have television. I threw my television out the window. We don't watch the TV anymore. But so I saw the buildings sometime after 9 o'clock in the morning. So that's when I saw it. At first, of course, you think that this is not real. And then, it starts sinking in. And then, of course, the other plane came in.
This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the 2 towers. A huge explosion now, raining debris on all of us.
When the Twin Towers collapsed and we watched it on the television, I found it hard to believe. It was shocking. It just seemed impossible.
I went inside, but I was preoccupied with all the events that had happened there in my neighborhood. I didn't really pay that much attention after that. I had major problems in my own circumstances that distracted me from really paying that much attention. Building 7, however, was a different story.
second building collapsed. He came back 20 minutes later, looking like a Three Stooges movie covered in plastic. I swear to God. But he got a good thing, man. That's some good shit. Then we went back there. Whoa, 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 whoa!
On September 11th, 2001, 7 hours after the North Tower had fallen, a third building collapsed. This was World Trade Center 7, a 47-story building on the north side of the complex, more than 300 feet from the North Tower. After being subjected to small office fires on isolated floors, Building 7 fell straight down, symmetrically, in approximately 7 seconds.
You didn't hear anything about the World Trade Center 7, not for a long time. And we'd never experienced, prior to that day, a steel frame building collapsing due to fire. It just didn't happen.
It piques your engineer's interest, I think, speaking as an engineer, even more than the Twin Towers, because it was more of a spontaneous failure, that there must be more of a structural, it wasn't hit by a plane, of course, must be more of a structural reason why that happened.
Although the destruction of Building 7 was a structural anomaly that merited an exhaustive investigation, the debris was quickly shipped away from the site.
You know, typically, let's say if you have an airplane disaster, you have the FAA and the investigators gathering every little piece of that plane and piecing it back together.
There's a generic procedure that you should follow. And one of the first things that you want to do is save the evidence.
Building 7 did not require the immediate search and rescue operation that the Twin Towers did. Building 7 didn't come down till 5:20 in the afternoon, and there was nobody in the building, by all accounts. That destruction of the evidence actually amounts to a federal crime. You can't tamper with the evidence at a crime scene. There was quick decisions made about taking that evidence away.
Building 7 was no ordinary office building. It housed offices of the Department of Defense, CIA, IRS, and Secret Service. It also held files related to numerous Wall Street investigations, many of which were not backed up elsewhere. Controversy started revolving around Building 7 and its collapse.
People just need to look at the whole reason that we got into this fiasco, 9/11, and ask themselves, how did Building 7 out of that complex fall?
They didn't answer many questions about why Building 7 fell in the way it did.
Building 7 of the World Trade Center came down. It was never hit by an airplane.
Santa Cruz, California. Good morning.
FEMA claimed in its 2002 Building Performance Study Report the specifics of the fires in WTC 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time.
Building 7 is made up of welded structural steel frames on the outside. It's like a tube structure on the outside of the building, and there's an inside core that's also a tube structure. If you're pulling on, members failing on the inside, pulling in, it's not going to break apart. It's just going to bend and twist.
There were no structural related shortcomings in the building, and I do know that the New York City codes are far more restrictive, particularly for high-rise buildings.
And yet on 9/11, many claimed that Building 7 would collapse. This included members of the New York Fire Department.
So we were setting up triage as close to the pile as possible, as on it in many cases. By noon or 1 o'clock, they told us we had to move from that triage site up to Pace University, a little further away, because Building 7 was going to come down or being brought down.
Did they actually use the word brought down, and who was it that was telling you this?
The fire department. They did use the word, we're going to have to bring it down.
The news agencies had their say as well, with some even claiming Building 7 had collapsed before it had done so.
We are getting information now that one of the other buildings, Building 7,
in the World Trade Center complex is on fire and has either collapsed or is collapsing.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down. The building is about to blow up.
Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
As you can see behind me, the Trade Center appears to be still burning. We see these huge clouds of smoke and ash. And
this is it.
That's the building coming down.
Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God! No! No!
What we've been fearing all afternoon has apparently happened. We were watching number 7 World Trade.
Despite the rush to remove the debris from Building 7, a group of engineers from the Worcester Polytechnic Institute, volunteering for FEMA, managed to secure a single piece of steel from Building 7 for analysis. They were shocked to see that the steel resembled, in their words, Swiss cheese. The Journal of the Minerals, Metals, and Materials Society stated that there was evidence of a severe high-temperature corrosion attack on the steel. This strongly suggests that the temperatures in this region of the steel beam approached around 1,000 degrees Celsius, or 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. FEMA's hypothesis was a liquid eutectic mixture containing primarily iron, oxygen, and sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. The temperatures required to produce liquid iron far exceed those achievable from an office fire.
That shows there's quite a bit of other chemicals involved causing the steel to corrode and basically disintegrate like that.
FEMA referred to these extreme temperatures as a very unusual event, and pointed out that this same phenomenon was seen in samples from one of the Twin Towers. This might be related to the fact that Ground Zero became the site of the longest burning structural fire in history, with extremely high temperatures located specifically in the footprint of the Twin Towers and Building 7. The National Construction Safety Team Act was signed into law, tasking the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, to investigate the collapse of World Trade Center 1, 2, and 7. In 2008, 3 years after its report on the collapse of the Twin Towers, NIST released its final report on the collapse of Building 7. This was a moment heavily anticipated by many, as Building 7 had been marred with controversy since it collapsed. The report would be, for all intents and purposes, the government's official story regarding what happened.
Eventually, a girder on floor 13 lost its connection to a critical interior column. This began a cascading chain of failures of 8 additional floors. With the support of these floors gone, we now had column 79 unsupported over multiple floors, and it buckled, which initiated the fire-induced progressive collapse of the building.
NIST's explanation for the collapse of Building 7 was thermal expansion, a new collapse phenomenon that it claimed to have discovered. NIST stated that a primary load-bearing girder attached to column 79 became dislodged from its column connections, causing a series of failures through columns 80 and 81, bringing the entire building down. According to NIST, even without the initial structural damage caused by debris impact from the collapse of WTC 1, WTC 7 would have collapsed from fires having the same characteristics as those experienced on September 11, 2001. Conspicuously absent from NIST's report is the corroded piece of steel from Building 7, despite FEMA having identified it as a key piece of evidence. The extreme temperatures responsible for the corrosive attack on the steel were magnitudes higher than the maximum temperatures estimated by NIST to have occurred inside Building 7. The New York Times referred to that piece of steel as perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation.
There's a reference often made to a piece of steel from Building 7. That there was no evidence that any of the residue in that piece of steel had any relationship to an undue fire event in the building or any other kind of incendiary device in the building.
They seem to focus on a solution right from the very beginning and ignore all evidence that would have led them in any other direction. So that's bass backwards, as they say.
My concern about the NIST reports is they ignored evidence, and it wasn't because they didn't know about it.
And I see that sometimes in engineering, in the business, where your boss would tell you, focus on this. The way they modeled it was somewhat pushing the limit, putting it mildly. They got to a point where they did NIST did a beautiful animation of the building, which looks like, and I keep repeating the same thing, it looks like it's crumpling like a beer can, as opposed to basically falling straight into its footprint.
I never worked for NIST, but I was a resident engineer for the Army Corps of Engineers for a few years. I have a very strong feeling about the responsibilities of what engineers have in general, in particular engineers that work for the government. They have a higher responsibility in some ways, or they should feel that way. I did.
There was just this silence in the academic world about this subject. So we began looking around for someone that would be willing to undertake such a study. And fortunately, through a series of personal acquaintances, we ran across Professor Halsey up at the University of Alaska at Fairbanks.
He's a straight arrow type of person. He wants to look at things from a very rational, impartial perspective, blocking all the noise out, which is really what is needed in this case.
In 2015, Professor Halsey began his investigation into the collapse of Building 7, funded by Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth.
Okay, when did I first learn about the collapse of Building 7? It was when I was first contacted by John Thay, who is a active member of AE 9/11 Truth. And he asked me to see if I would be willing to do this study, and I turned him down. And he came back again and said, hey, can we get an estimate from you? And I turned him down. Then he came back again, asked me again. I said, well, okay, I'll give you an estimate. That's when we basically got started. I was flown to New York, and there I began to see footage, and I began to see the area, and I walked around the area. It was a few days where I was educated on exactly what happened, where it happened, what the conditions were, saw footage that I could get, and so forth.
Let's just talk about the overall problem. The building had a symmetric free fall that occurred suddenly over 8 stories, meaning that the entire building, the footprint of a football field, each floor was the size of a football field. And no steel frame building has ever completely collapsed due to fire. That's a concern. It looks like the core was removed for 8 stories to promulgate that 8-story free fall.
So that's about as symmetrical collapse as you can get.
You can't get much more symmetrical than that, no.
And you can't get something like that unless you create it.
You see the east side penthouse coming down first.
I see that.
You see that?
Yep.
And then if you look at the shock wave, it only goes down 15 stories.
If there is controversy, that means that not everyone's satisfied with the answer. If we can change that, if we can give the public and the engineers an understanding of truly what did happen, it's worth it to me to be able to do that work.
I don't develop first impressions. I can't afford first impressions. I develop material, and then from that I develop what I think are the conditions.
I'm really kind of shocked. I mean, I knew this, but it makes no sense that you would not take the steel. I mean, we do it for planes. We do it for anything that breaks.
This girder is A2000. It's designated A2001. Its shop drawing has never been released.
Really?
No.
Why is that?
That's a good question.
I really do enjoy complications. And the more complicated, the more I enjoy it. When I first started, I had a couple of students that were really interested, and they spoke to their families and they just chose not to work out it. They thought it was too risky. You know, it's a couple of students that had spent their lives thinking about this. So.
For Halsey, who's in his 70s, and this happened like over 10 years ago now, but over 10 years ago when this happened, I was in 2nd grade, so I'm going to be living with the implications of this for a much longer time. I don't trust what's been said on either side fully, so that's why I'm really interested in the actual scientific reasoning behind all of it.
If fire caused Building 7 to collapse, it would be the first ever induced collapse of a steel frame building, high-rise building due to fire. If you imagine these white lines right here are vertical, and you can see as you look at it that the structure is basically coming down as a straight line. It's amazing how straight it's dropping. So it kind of indicates there was no resistance to the drop. In December 2007, it was acknowledged in the advisory committee meeting of NIST that the fires in WTC 7 were ordinary office fires and burned out in a given location in about 20 minutes. Basically, they said that fire caused expansion contraction of enough movement that the bearings that this girder sat on that supported that column moved off the bearing system and it caused the column to drop. We're creating a virtual building when we're going to simulate its behavior due to the conditions that we're going to give it. So that's the approach. I'm taking the worst condition, I'm going to look at the best condition. Right now I'm looking at the worst. And if I can't make it do what everybody else said it did with the worst, then it didn't happen.
I've definitely seen the whole free fall that we were talking about. I mean, it's unsymmetrical, and then you take the one beam out and it just collapses in a complete straight parallel path, which is really fishy.
There was a report on it, and then they said that the fire shouldn't have, it took it down, the fire took it down, but we don't know why it did. Like all the columns failed all at once. It didn't add up.
So did the presentation change anything about how you felt about the World Trade Centers and World Trade Center 7?
Yeah.
It's my intention, quite frankly, to not have a point of view about what may have brought this building down. But I think what we can do is to eliminate those things that could not have happened.
The difficulties we have in doing that is there's no data. They hold off all the steel, they hold all the concrete, they hold off all the materials.
Professor Halsey recruited 2 PhD students to assist him in his study.
My name is Feng Xiao, and I'm a PhD student of Dr. Halsey, and I'm now working on the World Trade Center 7 and the investigations collapse reason.
My name is Jilly Kwan. I'm a PhD student as well. I work with Dr. Halsey. He works as my advisor. My PhD dissertation will be about high-rise steel frame building under fire.
So WTC 4, 5, and 6, they were basically 8- and 9-story buildings, steel buildings actually. And those were built in 1970, about 14 years prior to WTC 7 being built. All 3 of those buildings suffered great amount of damage, but they didn't fail. They didn't actually have a progressive collapse. We began by taking a look at the geometry of the building. 47 stories. It's not symmetrical. Framing was not symmetrical. And so the first thing I did is ask my students, I said, I need to find the centroids of these floors. I need to know that if you pushed on it, where that centroid is going to be. In other words, center of mass. And the whole reason behind that was that if it was going to fail, it would try to fail around that spot. So we ended up with erection drawings, and then from the erection drawings, we put that into a 3D model in AutoCAD.
Okay, so the last couple of weeks I have been building World Trade Center 7, The first 7 floors, the first 4 or 5 floors that we do not have all the information about, because the World Trade Center 7 was built upon a electrical substation, and the original as-built for the electric substation were missing.
About a year ago or two, when they were both here, quite frankly, there was a couple guys that contacted them and asked them not to do any more studies with me because they felt the project was flawed and they shouldn't be doing any research. And they both came to me and they said, here's what the email that we got. And they said, we plan on continue working with you. And I found that kind of interesting. So I guess there's a group out there called debunkers, and that was one of them. But they didn't email me. They didn't tell me about it. They only told the students. But the students felt like they were doing really good work.
I wanted to ask Tony. Tony, you introduced me to this in New York. Are you still there, and do you have any comments?
They're grasping the air that there was a little bit of fire. You're going to give them their temperatures, Leroy, and it's still not going to have a problem.
Well, I think, at this point, I have chosen to assume there's no fireproofing anywhere. And if I can put that as a boundary and we don't have a problem, then all of a sudden that whole issue, that whole chapter by Nice is wrong. We know that.
We then used 2 computer programs, Abacus, which is an extremely powerful program, highly sophisticated. I then had the other student also duplicating that with another computer program, that was SAP 2000. From that, we looked at floor 12 and floor 13, as did NIST, and we began to examine the conditions on those floors. The Nice report basically said that the column 79, which is off center, is way off on the corner. I'll show it to you in a minute if you want to see it. It moved off the supports because of the expansion of the heat, and it couldn't stay on the bearings, and therefore it brought that whole building down. Our preliminary results is not finding that. We initially did not even go to looking at NIST. What I had to do was paint from a clear palette with nothing there and build the case of whatever happened from 0 influences. Pure science all the way. Now this has everything to do with the response under a fire situation. I'm not talking about the actual failure yet. I'm talking about, was there a possibility it could lead up to failure through these fundamentals that NIST looked at and said they could, I looked at and said they couldn't. There were also plates that were fastened to the to column 79, and those stiff plates would have blocked any movement of A2001 off that base plate. Coming back to the exterior walls, they fixed those instead of allowing them to be what they were, and so all the movement was to the west, according to them, and actually the movement was to the east. So that was a huge difference in behavior and response.
There's at least a dozen things that are very seriously wrong with the NIST report. Steel has a very well-known coefficient of thermal expansion. You know that when you heat the beam so much, if it has a certain length, it's going to expand a certain amount. These things can be calculated very closely. Their calculations don't add up. That beam couldn't have expanded far enough to do what they said it did. So that's a very basic problem. Secondly, they said that beam that expanded and pushed this girder, A2001, off of its seat at column 79, which began this whole process. There's several things wrong with that scenario. They said that the flange of the girder moved so far past the seat at the column that the flange curled up, the girder then fell. Well, with the stiffener on there, the girder flange can't curl up. It's too stiff. So that's a problem. Then they ignored the fact that the girder itself was heated, and the girder would also expand along with the beam, and when the girder expands, it's caught behind the stiffener plates on the edge of the column, so it can't move past the edge of the seat. So then there's the fact that their analysis claimed that there was no shear studs on the girder or the beams, and that would force those members to act in concert with the concrete slab above it, which would limit its ability to expand. So all these things are problems. They come back with a letter saying, that wouldn't have affected the behavior of the girder. Those plates were there to stiffen the web, not the flange. They can't even get an engineer to sign that letter. They get somebody from the Public Relations Department to write back and respond in that manner, because no engineer would ever sign that kind of a statement. It's patently wrong. Nobody wants to be responsible for that, so they get somebody that doesn't even have expertise in the field that they're talking about to write a letter and give us that explanation. It's farcical.
We're in an age now where transparency is kind of something that everybody is looking for. NIST comment that they won't release their details because of some risk to the public.
So that's a problem for engineers. You have to find out what went wrong. In the case of Building 7, it's shrouded in mystery because the conditions which supposedly caused the failure aren't being released. They've been held under lock and key because the government claims that the release of that information would be a danger to public safety.
Previously, they would have released it if it was asked in a different light, but just because, there's interest in actually doing a real study here. I think, I don't know, for whatever reason, maybe they're afraid to be discredited or whatever it is. So it's a defense mechanism, maybe. So you don't release information that discredits your study.
And then the exact opposite with Halsey's report. It's a gigantic file. The system I have in my office isn't even big enough to handle it. And it's got everything. It's all there for anybody that wants to look at it. Why can't NIST do the same thing? I have no idea. That kind of gets to part of the reason I don't work for the Army Corps of Engineers anymore, too. You know, what you're doing is incorrect. It's not right. You shouldn't be doing it that way. Shut up, Granger, and go back to your desk.
The findings that we have got, we're very comfortable with. It's based on sound science. It's consistent with the observations. It's simple. It's straightforward. It's elegant, technical. It's understandable by people. When we looked at, as I said, all of the alternative theories that were presented, there were only few that rose to be credible in our technical judgment. When we see evidence that, in fact, you have robust science behind alternative theories, we will look at them.
Okay, any more questions?
The draft report of Professor Halsey's study was released for public comment in September 2019, 4 exhausting years later.
Well, I'm a perfectionist. I'm very satisfied with what we found. The thing that threw me for a loop is that I thought surely the progressive collapse and the collapse understanding would have been more clear. We spent almost a year on that issue alone. So that was a surprise to me. I didn't expect that to be the case.
How much has changed between the draft report that we're scrolling through right now and what the final report will be?
Hardly any.
Really?
Not much. A few little things here and there, but for the most part, it's not significant. So pretty pleased about that.
They went through every single one of the components, the initiating events, the beam failures, the column failures, and then, of course, the entire building failure. And every one of those events was impossible to show to make the building collapse the way it came down. It was impossible. And he uncovered that if you do actually cause all these elements within the building to collapse, what's going to happen? The NIST model shows the building crumpling, as we had talked about. Going further there, what happens after that is that the building actually leans to one side and does not disintegrate and collapse into its footprint.
There was no reason for anyone to think that World Trade Center 7, with the fires that were in it, was going to collapse at all. Now that we have the Halsey report, we know that every column in the building needed to fail almost simultaneously for the building to fall in the manner that it did.
Professor Halsey's final conclusions regarding Building 7 are as follows. The principal conclusion of our study is that fire did not cause the collapse of WTC 7 on 9/11. Contrary to the conclusions of NIST and private engineering firms that studied the collapse. The secondary conclusion of our study is that the collapse of WTC 7 was a global failure involving the near simultaneous failure of every column in the building. The simultaneous failure of all core columns over 8 stories, followed 1.3 seconds later by the simultaneous failure of all exterior columns over 8 stories, produces almost exactly the behavior observed in videos of the collapse, whereas no other sequence of failures that we simulated produced the observed behavior.
So what does that really tell you? It really tells you that all those interior columns came out at once. At once. The exteriors also, a few seconds later, came out at once, giving you free fall, which comes down, straight down.
No thermal expansion, no girders walking off their seat. Sever the columns over 8 stories, and the building comes straight down.
Our take-home message today is that the reason for the collapse of World Trade Center 7 is no longer a mystery. It fell because thermal expansion, a phenomenon not considered in current building design practice, caused a fire-induced progressive collapse.
I feel good about what we did. Consulting engineering firms, architectural firms, they depend heavily on governmental grants, governmental funds. They don't want to cut off the hand that feeds them. And I feel like that's been a factor for some time.
In fact, after the draft was released a few months ago, we arranged for him to give a presentation down at the University of California at Berkeley, which is my alma mater, and which I was hopeful there would be some positive response from the faculty there. And we got zero response. They just do not want to touch this subject. You know, we can speculate upon the reasons. It usually involves money.
When they get beyond that and can share knowledge scientifically at the professional engineering level, you're going to see a big difference. And I'm pretty optimistic about that.
Early on, I had a lot of conversations with peers. So I would ask, please take a look at this thing and tell me what you think. And the last person who actually responded gave me some feedback. He said, I agree with you, Kamal. Click. And that was it. The last time I heard from him. But I can understand. I mean, it's a tough thing to talk about, and it's a downer. It's a downer at parties. I can tell you that. If you want to shut down a conversation, this is what you start with. This is what you talk about.
ASCE, the Journal of Engineering Mechanics, which is one of their publications, has been the publication that has justified the official story about how the towers came down. The NIST report on the Twin Towers never explains why the buildings collapsed. It gives a theory for why the collapse initiated, but it doesn't explain how the buildings collapsed. So they're relying on Besant's paper that was published in the Journal of Engineering Mechanics by the ASCE. The roadblock is that these professional organizations are being presented to the public as if the engineering profession stands behind the NIST reports and believes in the veracity of those reports. Whereas in fact, the reality is that when the membership is actually made aware of the contents of those reports, they do not believe them. They do not believe that they are sound engineering reports that meet the standards of our profession.
And I know quite a few engineers. I wouldn't say that I know more than other people do, but I'm familiar with a lot of them. Their response is they kind of like to get on with life. They're not so sure they want to get really involved in this situation. The common phrase that appears in the engineering boards of all the states, that's we're here for the public health, safety, and welfare. That's why we're professional engineers.
It's our obligation, it's our duty to basically find the engineering truth. not necessarily the overall truth.
The work that we're doing is ultimately going to make the difference. I have that confidence because I know the truth always comes out.
The fact of the matter is, if there's a problem with the collapse of Building 7, there's a problem with 9/11. And considering that 9/11 has led to irreparable change to America's domestic and foreign policies, that's a very big problem.
There is nobody that you can ask, where were they on 9/11? They can't tell you, right? So that tells us right there that 9/11 was a world-changing day, world-changing events. So many times I hear post 9/11, pre 9/11, everybody divides world history now from 9/11 before and 9/11 after. That's the reality of the world that we live in. We all know that the world changed profoundly on 9/11, and it's all built upon this premise. And the fact that it could be a different story, I think it's hard for people to face that.
Like the story says, I mean, what are you going to tell your granddaughter? That you did nothing? I mean, I hate to see the planet destroyed, people's livelihoods getting destroyed overseas, and I mean, it's just very disturbing. We got to stop this craziness, this insanity. You know, that's why I don't subscribe to any of the media anymore. Just Zippo.
I'd like to see a world where we weren't constantly at war, living in fear, a world where there is more resources devoted to actually developing the potential of the coming up generation, having to tolerate a government that feels the need to have surveillance of all of our activities, our personal conversations, and everything that we do.
The only difficult thing about change is change itself. Some people don't want to do that. They're afraid to do that. They don't want to open that door. They're willing to go in and out the other door that they've used for years and years, and it works fine. I don't know what's behind that door, and I don't want to go there. That door that you've been using, it works fine. The hinges don't squeak, and the latch works. What more can you ask?
I'm worried. I'm worried about this country right now. We just seem to be doing a lot of yelling and screaming and no hearing, no listening. Maybe some hearing, but no listening. So are we in a post 9/11? Yes, we are. Does that mean just that is a problem? I think it's bigger than that. I just don't know where we are right now. It's a bit troublesome. Is that the question you're asking?
(9/11, 5:20 p.m. Tower 7 collapses, much to question. This report faulty, needs correction. Lies used as weapons against facts, pure deception. The truth is the truth, there's no neglecting, detecting a cover up. What's the connection? 7.
If the press really wanted to hop on the story, if we really had a valid press, maybe they would jump into what happened to Building 7 and all the rest of the information that happened on 9/11. Thank you, sir.
Oak Creek, Wisconsin.
7 did not fail due to fire. Proof prevails. Explosions heard, yet a search for explosives never occurred. Why omit this potential evidence? So suspicious. Misreport fictitious, malicious deeds to which we bear witness. 7.
You hear this clap, sounds like thunder. Shock waves going through. You can see a shock wave go up, the windows blast out. You know, it's like I thought I was watching a movie. It was so, I mean, I can't believe this is happening. You know, it's really ridiculous. But you know, came down floor by floor.
I certainly am much more open-minded about it than I was, and it is because of the involvement of the 9/11 families and all these engineers and architects. Clearly, they know more than I do. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thank you.